Hello everybody! Today I'm going to tell you the history of Western esotericism and occultism. The entire thing. It won't be completely comprehensive, but it will give you a broad strokes understanding, and we will be going into detail wherever there is something particularly funny or interesting. I don't believe in magic, but this is a story about people who do believe. Without further ado, we will start with the ancient Greeks. Believed to have lived between the 6th and 5th centuries BCE, Pythagoras is most famous today for his work in the field of mathematics. But he also began a theological movement called Pythagoreanism, in which the universe is thought to be a mathematical construct. Pythagoras was one of the first people to call themselves a philosopher, and Iamblichus, who we'll talk about later, called him, quote, the leader and father of divine philosophy, end quote. Unfortunately, it's hard to pin down with certainty exactly what Pythagoras himself believed in, for 5 main reasons. Firstly, we have none of his writings. Secondly, even the earliest literary mentions of Pythagoras come 150 years after his death. Thirdly, the only complete records of his life were written by likely biased sources like Iamblichus, many hundreds of years after the fact. Fourthly, it is known the ideas and workings of several figures were falsely attributed to Pythagoras retroactively. Fifth and final reason is that Pythagoreanism itself has warped or expanded upon Pythagoras' original words, which is probably why Aristotle referred to members of the movement as so-called Pythagoreans, because all we have is hearsay. So what do we know? Well, his legendary status in Greece began when he returned from a visit to Egypt. At the time, Egypt was considered the source of the finest esoteric wisdom, plus the greatest mathematicians. For the Greeks then, perhaps evoking Egyptian wisdom shared a similar quality to modern-day Western occultists and cult leaders evoking Eastern wisdom. We know he brought various ideas to Greece such as the immortality of the soul, reincarnation, and various religious rituals. He believed that reality was likely a mathematical construct and that planetary bodies moved in accordance with the harmonies and rhythms of an all-encompassing divine music. His views and concepts were rarely proved mathematically, but his optimistic perspective on the fate of the soul and the universe at large allowed his cult to garner substantial support, both during his time and long after his death. Pythagoras' greatest dislike was fava beans, because they give you gas, which he either believed to be your body expelling the essence of life itself, or he maybe believed that beans contain the souls of the dead, so it's kind of like you're expelling ghosts out of your rectum. Indeed, the most popular telling of Pythagoras' death was that while being chased by a killer, he was blocked by a field of beans, which of course he just would not tread through, and thus swiftly died to his assailant. While the tale is likely a myth, many ancient philosophers did meet their ends in rather unusual ways. So why are we even talking about him here? Firstly, because his ideas influenced Plato in his later life, but also because hero worship of Pythagoras became very popular in the 1st century BCE, to such an extent that his ideas get bound up in Gnosticism and Neoplatonism, whether or not Pythagoras actually shared any of their beliefs, and obviously Pythagoras had a great impact on mathematics and esotericism to this very day. To quote Alfred North Whitehead, the safest general characterization of the European philosophical tradition is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato. End quote. Plato puts forward 2 important ideas for our purposes. Firstly, that there is a divine realm of perfect archetypal forms, by which I mean everything you can think of has a kind of eternal base template situated in a higher realm. This base template is used to create an endless variety of imperfect copies, which are what we see on Earth. For example, all humans are just an imperfect copy of the divine form of humanity. These become known as the Platonic forms. To illustrate this idea, let's say I asked you to imagine a car. What is a car? Well, cars come in many shapes and sizes, but somehow we all know what is and isn't a car, based purely off of how car-ish it is. As such, whatever vague notion of a car you imagined in your head when I asked the question is probably pretty close to the Platonic ideal of a car. You can do this with anything, such as a chair or cat, and the same idea applies. Another way to describe a Platonic form is as an archetype, which famous psychologist Carl Jung, 1785 to 1835, would later use as the foundation of his idea of collective archetypes. Anyway, what ends up getting taken from this concept is that our world is almost entirely imperfect, but there's a perfect realm situated dimensionally above us, from which our world is projected or emanated. Indeed, the world of forms is more real than our world. Later, the Neoplatonics and Gnostics will argue about this idea. Second idea Plato posits is that there is not a pantheon of human-like gods all squabbling and fighting amongst each other like in Greek mythology, but rather a single perfect god from which all good emanates. You may recognize this idea of an infinitely benevolent monotheistic god from such hits as Christianity, and Plato's conception of God would vastly influence the evolution of Christian theology. It is now that the rabbit hole truly begins, specifically with the Gnostics. Everything I am about to explain about the Gnostics and Neoplatonists is explained in much greater detail on the Esoteric YouTube channel, so make sure to hit him up. Gnosis is the Greek word for mystical knowledge or insight. It specifically means intuitive or spiritual knowledge, and as such had positive connotations in the ancient world, where Gnostics were deemed wise or enlightened men. Many people in history were called Gnostics based on their supernatural wisdom. In the modern day, however, Gnosticism usually refers specifically to a now heretical movement in early Christianity. Gnosticism as a movement only survived beyond a few centuries AD, so information on them is pretty scarce. For a long while, one of the only sources of information we had about them was a Christian scholar named Irenaeus, who wrote very critically about them in his treatise, Detection and Overthrow of Gnosis, falsely so called, which was written around 180 AD, where he calls out the Gnostics, or more specifically the Valentinians, for leading people astray from what he considered to be the one true Christianity. He traces this heresy back to a figure called Simon Magus, or Simon the Magician, who we will be exploring in absolutely no detail at all. In 1945, however, an ancient structure called the Nag Hammadi Library was discovered in Egypt, containing 13 leather-bound codices comprised of 52, mostly Gnostic treatises, but also 3 works of the Corpus Hermeticarum, which of course relates to Hermeticism, a subject matter we will get into later. So what did the Gnostics believe, and why did this anger the other Christian groups? Well, the Gnostics had this alternative cosmology that was so convoluted and so long-winded it'd be really obnoxious to describe it. So let's do that. At the top center of the divine realm is the absolute or divine godlike entity sometimes called the One or Monad, who is literally everything. It is called the One because it is a compositionally pure, singular entity that is absolute and eternal. Obviously, such an entity couldn't possibly account for all the disparity and individuality we see, so it needs to disseminate and fragment. This occurs when the One has a thought about itself, which creates she or Barbelo, which is both sort of part of the One but also functionally separate. She becomes the universal womb that begats everything, and the two of them start to have sweet, sweet thoughts together. Thoughts from this point forward being kind of analogous to sex, and they breed a pantheon of beings called aeons, which are eternal spirits or aspects of the one true divinity. These aeons and their offspring form a sort of spiritual realm, somewhat akin to Plato's realm of forms. For the Gnostics, this place is real and eternal, while the material world is a flawed imitation. Sophia is the aeon of wisdom, below Christ in the hierarchy. Each of the lower aeons exist in a male-female pair, despite being theoretically genderless, because as we said, thoughts are kinda like sex for divine beings. In the, now apocryphal, Secret Book of John, Sophia tried to create a thought of her own without consent of her male counterpart or asking permission from the One. She gave birth to an imperfect creation, a misshapen pseudo-divine being called Yaldabaoth, or sometimes called Saklath, who was a snake with the face of a lion. This type of flawed divine craftsman is called a demiurge, and Sophia is so ashamed of it she hides it behind a cloud, a trick which apparently worked so well that Yaldabaoth never meets another heavenly being for the rest of his life. As a result, Yaldabaoth, in his ignorance, thinks that he is the only divinity, and thus creates an imperfect world based on his own vague memories of the true divine realm. The world that he creates is, of course, the material realm as we know it. Trigger warning for the next 30 seconds. After Eve is created, she is raped by Yaldabaoth to create Cain and Abel. Meanwhile, Adam and Eve conceive a more pure child called Seth. Seth is considered the progenitor of the Gnostics, aka wise men. These people are called the seed of Seth, or Sethians. Gnostics believe the God of the Old Testament was actually Yaldabaoth, while in the New Testament it's the Aeons, or true God. They use evidence such as God in the Old Testament saying, "I am a jealous God, and there is no other God apart from me," from Exodus 25, to which the apocryphal book of John states, "For if no other exists, of whom would he be jealous?" Since the Gnostics believed the world to be a flawed place, they knew humanity needed help escaping, which is the purpose for which Jesus was sent. Jesus was an Aeon sent by the true God, or monad. So, what kind of stuff would the Gnostics do on a practical level then? Well, since they believed that a human mind could experience gnosis, that is to say, acquaintance with God within this mortal life, it is assumed many of their practices were attempting to achieve such a state. They often performed a baptism involving something they called the 5 seals, but nobody has any idea what that is. Though it is known a Gnostic would be baptized several times during their life. The Gnostics were somewhat split between the Sethians, so called because they believed they were descended from Seth, the Valentinians, and the Marcionites. The Valentinians were founded by a man named Valentinus in the 2nd century, and they took a lot from the Gnostic myths but modified them with more clearly Christian terminology. Texts attributed to the Valentinians include the Gospel of Truth and the Tripartite Treaties. Their worldview is less negative than the Sethians and more monotheistic. What today we think of as mainstream Christians, especially Irenaeus as mentioned earlier, hated the Gnostics mostly because of the Valentinians and not the Sethians. This is because, unlike the Sethians, the Valentinians seemed at first glance to be a whole lot like Orthodox Christians until you delve deeper and realize they basically worship heresy and read Apocrypha. It's worth mentioning, however, that at this time Christian theology was very competitive, and what we now call mainstream is just the strain of Christianity that won the War of Ideas. In 367 CE, a bishop of Alexandria named Athanasius published a letter to the churches in Egypt, listing what books are and are not canon. And indeed, Athanasius was the first Christian author to apply the term canon to the holy texts, mandating which ones were and were not heresy. The books allowed were the ones we're familiar with today, such as Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and so on. Everything else was deemed apocrypha and thus banned reading. The more obscure group related to the Gnostics are the Marcionites, founded by Marcion of Sinope. Marcion himself is credited with being the first Christian who tried to make a canonical New Testament, including a modified version of the Gospel of Luke and a few of the Pauline letters. He differs from the Gnostics and other derivatives by denying the Hebrew Bible and the Old Testament entirely. Alright, that's enough about the bloody Gnostics. If you want to know more, here's a list of their books. These ideas percolate for a while until we hit a period of Platonic philosophy historians arbitrarily mark as Neoplatonism, where an Egyptian man named Plotinus in the 3rd century expands on Plato's ideas mostly by accident, just by interpreting them. Plotinus fleshes out the cosmology of Plato's worldview in the following 3 ways. Number 1. The universe is comprised of a macro entity called the One or Monad, which is literally just everything. I know we just covered this idea in Gnosticism, but Plotinus doesn't really agree with the Gnostics about much else. Number 2. The monad also possesses a macro-consciousness called the nous, without which it would be unable to project the imperfect world for various fiddly reasons. Number 3. There is something called soul, which is our connection to the One. The material world is imperfect and unpleasant, but by deep meditation and contemplation we can reconnect to the One via the soul. Plotinus still believed in smaller gods by reason of them being entities closer to the One. Such entities would be called daimon, based on the Greek word for divine power or lesser god. This word was later translated by Christians into demon, meaning malignant spirit or heathen idol, and associated with fend, aka fiend in Middle English. In the age of Plotinus, of course, the word daimon had mostly positive connotations. A daimon is an intermediary spirit between humans and gods, usually attached to a person as a kind of guardian angel. Think of Stans from JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. Plotinus was kind of the Chuck Norris of mystics, in that people were more than happy to tell larger-than-life tales about his supernatural powers. Stories attributed to him include the time his daimon was summoned forth, but of course it was actually a true god. The time a rival philosopher called Olympius tried to cast a spell on Plotinus, but Plotinus had cultivated his soul to be so powerful that the spell ricocheted back onto Olympius. And of course, the time Plotinus refused to perform a ritual to appease the moon god because Plotinus felt the god should come to him, not the other way around. Actually, that last example probably actually happened. In reality, he was apparently a really nice guy. People would entrust their children into his care, and he was rather modest. Just like Plato, he believed that we are all imperfect versions of the perfect forms in heaven. As such, even though he was reportedly quite handsome, he didn't like the idea of being artistically depicted, since it would technically be an imperfect depiction of an imperfect depiction. As mentioned, Plotinus saw himself as simply clarifying or elaborating on Plato's ideas. Plotinus also believed that Plato had sort of unwritten doctrines, which Aristotle himself, a student of Plato, also believed in. These unwritten doctrines are thought to relate to Pythagoreanism and sacred geometry, though we can never totally be sure. Sacred geometry is an idea it is believed Plato inherited from the previously mentioned Pythagoras. In ancient Greece, it was not believed that geometry was a product of mathematics, rather that mathematics, and indeed the entire world, was a product of geometry. Geometry had primacy in all things, and by extension it was believed that certain geometric shapes had a kind of magical or divine quality of importance. Did you ever wonder why the occult is so full of pentagrams and other specific shapes? It likely derives from this concept, though I doubt if you asked a modern occultist why they're drawing a magic circle, they'd say, "Oh, it's because of Plato's unwritten doctrines and sacred geometry, of course." Plotinus also believed in a monad and dyad, a 1 and a 2 from which all is derived in a manner eerily similar to the modern computer science concept of 0 and 1, plus the infinite decimal points in between. One last note about Plotinus is that he didn't like the Gnostics very much because he felt their mythology overcomplicated Plato's simple and wholly sufficient cosmic system. He died at 66 years old from terrible bowel problems. His legacy is vast, all his writings survived and were compiled into a collection known as the Ennead, 54 treatises organized into 6 Enneads. So as mentioned, Plotinus liked his cosmology simple and as close as possible to Plato's ideas. He didn't really like the Gnostics because the Gnostics thought the material world was a awful, complicated prison made by a misshapen, lion-headed rapist demiurge snake. Unfortunately for our boy Plotinus, his theories became mostly discredited and replaced in Athens by the teachings of a Syrian man named Iamblichus, who picked holes in Plotinus's philosophy and provided a more satisfying alternative. The first major problem with Plotinus's ideas is that Plato himself was really undecided about whether or not physical matter and existence was good or bad. In the Phaedo, Plato says that the physical body is an affliction, something you are cured of when you die. But later in the Timaeus he seems to contradict himself by being far less negative about physicality. Kind of unexpected when you think about it. Most people really hate their physical form more and more as they get older, but I guess Plato felt the opposite. Plotinus quoted the Timaeus when railing against the Gnostics because he felt the Gnostics were hypocrites for not committing suicide if they hated physical reality so much. But Plotinus himself was ashamed of being stuck in his own body, thus making him also a hypocrite. Second problem for Plotinus is that in his view the soul is inextricably bound to a flawed material body. As such, the soul can never fully return to the One, but you can have a thin connection to your one true self, which can be contacted with via deep introspection and meditation. So Plotinus's answers about reality can be a bit confusing and unsatisfying, which gave Iamblichus the opportunity to usurp his cosmology. Iamblichus rejects the idea that the physical form is in any way connected to the Divine One, but luckily he's more positive about physicality itself, since he points out that the physical world is still an emanation or expression of the many demiurges who are divine aspects of the One or Monad. Plus, in his view, we can still escape our flawed materiality using something called henosis. Henosis is a co-creative process you partake in with divine entities in order to reconnect your soul with the One. This henosis is achieved via rituals called theurgy, which translates to God-doing, in which you use sympathetic symbology, vocalizations, and gestures to evoke or attract daimons, demiurges, or aeons to help you ascend. You see, the gods have emanated the cosmos as a web of harmonies or sympathies, which can establish a connection to the upper world from the lower world, thus beginning the process of spiritual purification, then ascend back to the One. This theurgy cannot compel or force higher entities to do anything. It can only encourage assistance or establish sympathy. Iamblichus states that a step-by-step practical guide to theurgy is pointless, since rituals are experiential and revelatory. Plus, they rely on the caprice of unknowable divine beings, and thus there is no one guaranteed reliable ritual. Despite this, there is an interesting element of experimentation, mathematical and scientific rigor to this kind of mysticism, which we'll also see in later figures like John Dee or Sir Isaac Newton. Much like Plotinus, Iamblichus considered all gods, though separate beings, to each be homogenized spiritually into the One. He believed that we use the intellect to comprehend our soul's burning desire to reconnect with its divine source, and thus use henosis and theurgy to ascend back to our true selves in the One. In much later traditions, like chaos magic, the symbology, dress, and atmosphere of theurgic ritual are used to psychologically break down the distinction between you and the god you are evoking. To the chaos mage, you are, after all, actually that god. All you need to do is break down the distinctions between you and the chosen deity. We will tackle stuff like modern chaos magic much later. Iamblichus, like many mystics and holy men of the time, stood firmly against sorcery. The distinction between higher magics like theurgy and lower magics labeled sorcery is fairly arbitrary, because both can apparently be used to manipulate the material realm for your own personal gain using rituals and symbology, to achieve effects like divination, levitation, or summoning daimons. However, Iamblichus would have it that sorcery is a disruptive, selfish mode of magic used only to fulfill materialistic desires, while true magic is oriented around escaping materiality altogether. Hermes Trismegistus is the legendary Egyptian founder of an occult tradition known as Hermeticism, named after him. He's associated with gods like Hermes from Greek myth and Thoth from Egyptian myths. In fact, he's a merge of the two brought about by the intermingling of Greek and Egyptian culture. As such, he's less of a concrete historical figure like Plotinus and Iamblichus and more of a symbolic godlike wise man, holder of all knowledge. He is purportedly the author of the Emerald Tablet, the Corpus Hermeticarum, and several other treatises and texts on the subject of philosophy, astrology, morality, cosmology, and most famously of all, alchemy. The overall goal of a Hermetic initiate is similar to other things we've talked about so far, that is to say, elevating and reuniting one's own soul and consciousness to the divine nous, achieve enlightenment, and transcend the material realm. This is done via spiritual education, ritual, and even alterations of consciousness. Unfortunately, while we have a lot of data about their philosophy, the texts about the practical endeavors of a hermit are apparently either exceedingly rare or lost. According to the Hermetics themselves, these texts are deliberately hidden for various reasons, such as the dangers of Christian zealotry, and hiding profound truth from those who are not yet ready to glimpse it. These texts would theoretically contain guides on the previously mentioned astrology, alchemy, and even magic. The followers of this philosophy often wandered the wilderness away from civilization, hence the famous idea of a hermit, sometimes shunned as rogue sorcerers or hobos, and sometimes embraced as wise men. Hermeticism had a property that set it apart from most popular religions of the time. That is to say, they saw the act of attempting to understand the world and its rules as the greatest tribute to God. This mindset made them ideal proto-scientists, because what others saw as a blasphemous attempt to decode divine law, they saw as a bid for ultimate gnosis and oneness with God. Naturally, this led to alchemy both as a practical concern and as a spiritual endeavor. As time went on, there was a lot of contention and disagreement about the morality of alchemy. The Church often saw it as a perversion of God's natural law, There were concerns about summoning demons, the creation of soulless homunculi, and other theologically dubious behaviors. On the other hand, many leaders of nations eventually saw hermits and alchemists as potentially very helpful. After all, if they really could transform one compound from another, what's to stop them from turning lead into gold? A leader who attained such a person as retainer could skyrocket the wealth of their entire nation, or more importantly, themselves. Another very popular myth about the masters of alchemy was that they knew how to create the elixir of life, a compound that, when imbibed, would extend one's lifespan to such a degree that a master alchemist need never fear death by age. This idea will become relevant later with figures like the Count of Saint-Germain. Jewish theology and mysticism has a huge and direct influence in Western esotericism beyond this point, and nothing more prominently so than the Kabbalah. The Kabbalah acts like a kind of metaphysical map or diagram, by which a spiritual journey to enlightenment can be charted. Much like the Hermetics, the Kabbalists believe that gnosis with God is attainable within this lifetime, and by extension there are certain actions that greatly increase your chances of reaching that state. In fact, the Hermetics liked the Kabbalah so much that they made their own with a Q, as in Quabbalah, leading to several splits in thought down the line, such as between the Ordo Templari Orientis and the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, both of which we will be covering later. The Kabbalah has this handy tree of life diagram. Hey, it looks kind of familiar, doesn't it? As you can see, the diagram depicts 10 circles, which are called the Sephirot or Sephirot. Oh yes indeed, the Kabbalah has had quite the influence on Japanese media. Anyway, our diagram starts here down at the lowly kingdom, or Malkuth, and our objective is to ascend upwards towards the crown or Kether. Along the way we chart our course through these lines or path, kind of like it's a roguelite game or something. The specifics of the Tree of Life differ in small ways between traditions. For example, sometimes there's a structure above the tree called the Unmanifest, or Veils of Negative Existence. Not negative as in bad, but negative as in mathematically. The veils are Ein, complete nothingness beyond even the concept of nothing, Ein Sof, the limitless, the nothing as we think of it, and finally the Ein Sof Or, limitless or infinite light. There's also sometimes more or less Sephirot, such as a secret 11th Sephirot called Da'ath, or knowledge. Sometimes there's 22 paths between the Sephirot, or sometimes 32. Sometimes there's little symbols in each of these Sephirot, sometimes there's Hebrew letters. The differences aren't all that important. What's important is that we, all together now, and sing along if you know the words, ascend back to divinity via gnosis. From this point forward, it's better for you to assume everybody I mentioned is using the Kabbalah. All of the secret orders are using it, the Wiccans and Neo-Pagans are using it, the Thelemites are using it, and various cults are using it. Even the left-hand path are sort of using it. Why, what's the left-hand path, you ask? Oh, it's like an edgier version of regular occultism. I can actually hear the occultists screaming at me that it's way more complicated than that. So let me clarify that for some people the left-hand path is about using unorthodox methods of achieving enlightenment via unpleasant or gruesome experiences rather than the usual meditation. After all, useful revelation rarely comes to people in a position of comfort and safety. For example, there's the Hypophic Quabbalah, studied by the Typhonian Order, which is like the evil tree of life. The Aghori in India who smear themselves in corpse juices and throw their own poop at people, as shown in this clip.
Oh my goodness. Ah! Oh my goodness.
And so on and so forth. If you meet a left-hand path user in the West, though, chances are good they'll just look like this. Personally, I really like the Tree of Life diagram because I think it's just kind of fun to literally draw a map of how to reach enlightenment. No, enlightenment is over there, stupid. You're going the wrong way. Freemasonry is a secretive fraternal organization, known for their dedication to traditions, ceremonies, and old rituals. In my attempts to be as thorough in my research as possible, I tried to get in contact with my local Masonic lodge for an interview. I tracked down their website and a phone number listed as their secretary. The lady who responded identified herself as working for a company which I presume to be made up. Then when I openly asked about the Masonic lodge, she sounded rather panicked by my forwardness. When I explained that I wanted to conduct an interview, she asked if I wanted a specific lodge member, to which I said no. Any member will do. She asked how I got this phone number, to which I told her about the website. She said that she didn't know there was a number listed there, which I found kind of funny, because it probably meant it was a private number for Mason use only, which they accidentally put online. She took my details and said she might get somebody to call me back, but I have received no response months later. I didn't really have a reason for telling you that tale just now, other than to pin the blame for any inaccuracies in this video on the Freemasons themselves rather than myself. After all, if they wanted to avoid misinformation, they should have just called me back, right? Anyway, back to the video. Nobody knows when Freemasonry started due to either a lack of record keeping, or more characteristically, deliberate obfuscation. Nevertheless, the popular theory is that the stonemasonry guilds of the Middle Ages responsible for the construction of cathedrals formed their own kind of inner circle. But as time went on and the demand for cathedral construction declined, they began to accept honorary members who maybe weren't even stonemasons. Plus, the group developed the rites, rituals, and trappings of a religious order. The first officially founded Grand Lodge was in England in 1717 CE. In 1926, a legendary French alchemist named Fulcanelli wrote a book called The Mystery of the Cathedrals, in which he analyzed the construction of old cathedrals and suggested that every single part of them was designed to convey secret messages and meanings, even down to the color and shape of rooms. Obviously, since old cathedrals were constructed exclusively by Freemasons, such conspiracy theories are always abound about them. While Freemasonry is at least officially opposed by the Catholic Church, Freemasonry does require that their members believe in a higher power of some kind. Of course, as a worldwide organization, Masonic lodges are each separate, and often enforce fairly different rules or follow different ideals from each other. As such, an analysis of Freemasonry as a whole is so difficult that I, as a non-scholar, cannot be bothered to dig into it too deeply, especially since they refused an interview. In fact, I only brought them up because Freemasons are going to show up a lot all the time as we go on. Luckily, I was able to actually get in contact with a Rosicrucian, and they gave me book recommendations to help with this research. See, Freemasonry, there's no need to play so hard to get. Also known as the Order of the Rose Cross, or Rosy Cross, Rosicrucianism is another secretive fraternal organization. Not unlike Freemasonry, and indeed many Rosicrucians are also Freemasons, though somebody can be a member of one without so much as touching the other. Also similar to Freemasonry, different branches can follow a variation of the core beliefs and practices. So don't take everything I'm about to say as a universal gospel. Rosicrucianism was first proliferated in the early 17th century by 3 books. The first book was deftly named Fama Fraternitatis of the Meritorious Order of the Rosy Cross, as addressed to the learned in general and the governors of Europe, published in 1614 by an anonymous author. The Fama Fraternitatis weaves a narrative in which a monk named Christian Rosencreutz travels to various countries to absorb their wisdom, then returns to his home nation of Germany to construct a secret Christian order, whose goal was to reform the world. They praise the famous Swiss physician Paracelsus, an alchemist and prophetic diviner who revolutionized medicine with his work Der großen Wundarznei, and who was later credited as the father of toxicology. The second book, named Confessio Fraternitatis, was also anonymously published in 1615, with its contents describing the kind of person the fraternity wants included in their ranks. The order shuns the arrogant, greedy, lazy, or insecure while seeking out the pious and virtuous. To quote, "Anyone who discerns those great letters that God has inscribed on the world machine, and has renewed through all the vicissitudes of empires, and who can understand, read, and inform himself from them, is already one of us, though he may be unaware as yet." End quote. In 1616, a book called The Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosenkreuz was written by a theologian named Johann Valentin André, in which Rosenkreuz undergoes a possibly allegorical mystical journey in 1420 CE involving a celestial wedding, which is actually symbolic of an alchemical transformation of purification, in which Rosenkreuz undergoes several trials which serve as metaphorical representations of the inner journey to enlightenment. Emphasized here is Rosenkreuz's common background and uncommon virtue, showing that material wealth need not be a prerequisite for entry to the order. So, with these three texts, Rosicrucianism successfully asserted itself into Renaissance theology. But what does Rosicrucianism actually believe in? Its beliefs are a synthesis of many different religions and occult practices. As you can tell by the cross and its symbol, Christianity is chief among them, but blended with Hermeticism, Gnosticism, Neoplatonism, Neo-Pythagoreanism, ancient Egyptian wisdom, Brahmic practices, and of course the Kabbalah. One might imagine there's some contradiction between all these seemingly disparate beliefs. But not so. A Rosicrucian sees a little bit of truth in all practices, since God is so ever-present in all people and cultures. For example, the Hermetic phrase, "as above so below," is perfectly compatible with the Christian Bible's Genesis 1:26 to 1:27, "So God created mankind in his own image." The order desires to subtly shape the spiritual evolution of mankind. It pivots around ideas of enlightenment and inner wisdom, with the goal of unraveling the mysteries of existence. Basically, gnosis as mentioned earlier. Before we end off this section, I need to mention psycho-spirituality. Psycho-spirituality is the act of deliberately entering an unusual mental state in order to access psycho-spiritual energies and metaphysical sources of information, often to achieve some sort of goal. This practice can be interpreted as overtly magical or pseudo-scientific depending on the practitioner, as we'll see later with the Cacophony Society and the San Francisco underground art scene, where the terms psychomagic and psychomagical experience will often come up, which is a very similar concept to psycho-spirituality. Oh, it's time for my favourite part of this whole thing, which is John Dee. Strap in. John Dee was an astronomer, mathematician, and court mage to Queen Elizabeth I of England, because back then having a court mage was not wholly unusual. His methods of magic were tied inextricably into his more scientific pursuits. Thus his rituals combined the exactness of mathematics allied with the convoluted philosophy of the Hebrew Kabbalah and Arabic magico-alchemical works, which produced a solid base from which magic, both natural and metaphysical, could be approached in a scientific manner. It is said that on a cold April day in 1582, an angel apparently descended into Dee's estate and handed John Dee an object, named the Shoe Stone, a piece of black polished obsidian. Apparently, if the right person looked into the Shoe Stone, they would see gods and angels. An alchemist and necromancer named Edward Kelly apparently had particular skill in using it. The angels would transmit their ideas to him via the Shoe Stone in Latin backwards, which he would transcribe as if by dictation. So John Dee would sit there transcribing the orations of Edward Kelly as he received angelic messages via the Shoe Stone. John Dee felt that by this process one could record the angelic language into a kind of translative dictionary, by which mortals could learn the language of heaven and speak to the angels in the divine tongue. Of course, by extension, any rituals performed speaking this language would be much more potent than, say, English or Latin. Thus, John Dee was also constructing a kind of magic system that is still used to this day. They call it Enochian magic. Haphazard scrying began in March 8, 1581. relying on equipment such as wax tablets, a scrying table, a gold tamen, and several shoe stones of obsidian and rock crystal. The scrying stone would be placed upon the elaborately engraved sigillum Eamath, a kind of magic circle, which was then placed in turn upon a special table, inscribed with a hexagram enclosed within a frame of Enochian letters and supporting specifically designed talismans. The early communications set down in Dee's Librae Mystorium deal with communications from angels, Anael and Uriel, who dictated the exact instructions for engraving the table, lamen, ring, and sigils required. Book 3 shows designs for the 7 talismans to be used on the scrying table, and concludes with the tabula collecta, of the 49 angels whose invocatory modus operandi is explained in the 4th book. The full magic system they used was eventually written out in De Heptarchia Mystica, so named because of the 7x7 angels whose invocations, seals, and sigils are described therein. Just to give you an idea of what this is like, here are 2 visual descriptions of such angels. First example. He appeared in his red apparel, and he opened his clothes, and there did issue mighty and most terrible ghastly flames of fire out of his sides, which no mortal eye could abide, to look upon any longer, while in the marvellous raging fire the word Borgias did appear tossed to and fro to the very flames. And the second example, therefore he appeared in a long purple gown, and on his head a triple crown of gold with a measuring rod of gold in his hand, divided into 3 equal parts in the form of a very well-proportioned man." End quote. His medium, Edward Kelly, became increasingly desperate over the years to escape John Dee because Dee almost never slept, expected long hours of labor, and had recruited Kelly via blackmail by threatening to out him as a necromancer. Kelly, for his part, tried to make the best of a bad situation by tricking Dee into letting Kelly sleep with his wife. As you can imagine, the events that took place within that house are rather muddled and bizarre. Here's a passage from John Dee's notes describing an average workday of the angelic conversations, where 3 or 4 earth spirits interrupt their invocations, mistakenly thinking Kelly called them to perform some groundwork. To quote, "As Edward Kelly was writing the 18th leaf, which was the spirits of the earth, in the afternoon about 4:30 of the clock he read a parcel thereof, plainly and aloud to himself, and thereupon suddenly at his side appeared 3 or 4 spiritual creatures, like labouring men having spades in their hands, their hair hanging about their ears, and hastily asked Edward Kelly what he would have them and wherefore he called them. Edward answered that he called them not. And they replied and said that he had called them, and he replied that he had called them not, and they replied that he had called them. Then I began to say they lied, for his intent was not to call them, but only to read and repeat that which he had written, and that every man who readeth a prayer to pursue the sense thereof, prayeth not. No more did he call them, and I bade they be packing out of the place. I thereupon removed from my desk, where I was ruling paper for his writing, to the green chair which was by the chimney. Presently Kelly cried out, and said that they had nipped him and broken his left arm by the wrist, and he showed me the bare arm. And he showed the bare arm, and there appeared on both the upper side and the lower side, imprinted deep in 2 red broad semicircles, and I, seeing that, sought for a stick. And in the meantime they assaulted him. He rose and cried to me, saying, 'They come flying on me, they come!' He put the stool he sat on between them, but still they came gaping or gurning at him. Then I asked him where they were, and he pointed to the place, and I took the stick and came to the place, and in the name of Jesus commanded those baggages to avoid, and smit a cross stroke at them, and presently they avoided. All thanks be to the one almighty and everlasting God, whose name be praised, now and forever. Amen." End quote. I love everything about that recalling of events. Oh, to be a fly on the wall in that room. Anyway, eventually Dee and Kelly parted ways. Not long after, Dee's house was raided and trashed by the public, who saw him as an unholy sorcerer. And Kelly became locked up for failing to demonstrate the ability to turn lead into gold, plus, being a necromancer. Long story short, while most mystics attempt to commune with the divine via revelatory experience, Dean Kelly tried to have a literal, verbal conversation with the divine entities, and whether or not they succeeded is dependent on who you're asking about it. Dee's proclivity to marry the concepts of science and magic was not uncommon for the era. Even famous scientist Sir Isaac Newton would be devoutly practicing alchemy during the following century, in pursuit of the Philosopher's Stone of course, and connection with a spiritual aspect of reality he felt mathematics could not hope to quantify. In 1745 AD, a mysterious man known only as the Count of Saint Germain is arrested by Horace Walpole, the 4th Earl of Orford, and son of the first Prime Minister of Great Britain, who subsequently wrote a letter to a friend in Florence. He mentioned the arrest of a man suspected of being a spy who went by the name Comte de Saint-Germain, who had been in England for 2 years. According to this message, Saint-Germain was fluent in basically every language, didn't eat unless he prepared the meal himself, he could sing, compose, and play the violin, and he talked of historical events as if he had lived them. The Prince of Wales was intrigued by this and sent for Saint-Germain, but the Count was already set free by that point and had disappeared again. Theories began to spread that the Count might be Cartaphilus, the wandering immortal of Jewish myth. This strange nobleman would emerge into the public from time to time. The Count of Saint-Germain became the must-have guest of any posh dinner party. A talented pianist, great singer, and conversationalist, fluent in all languages and all accents. When asked how he knows so much about history, he would say, "Well, I was there." Historians would try to stump or trip up Germain in conversation, but he would always have the answers. Casanova once said of him, "The Count of Saint-Germain was a scholar, linguist, musician, and chemist. As a conversationalist, he was unequaled." He was also apparently a gifted alchemist, who claimed he had the Philosopher's Stone and the Elixir of Life. He boasted he could remove the impurities in gems, and naturally King Louis of France made him demonstrate this ability. Saint-Germain apparently succeeded in purifying an extremely expensive gemstone, thus over doubling its value, so the king sent Germain up with a whole laboratory, but Germain disappeared once again. While it might have been his extraordinary learnedness that led acquaintances to see that he was a remarkable man, it was really an anecdote from 1760 that is most likely what gave rise to the notion that Saint-Germain could be immortal. In Paris that year, Countess von Georgi heard that a Count of Saint-Germain had arrived for a soirée at the home of Madame de Pompadour, mistress of King Louis XV of France. The elderly Countess was curious because she had known a Count of Saint-Germain while in Venice in 1710, 50 years earlier. Upon meeting the Count again, she was astonished to see that he hadn't appeared to age at all, and asked him if it was his father that she knew in Venice. "No, madam," he replied, "but I myself was living in Venice at the end of the last and the beginning of this century. I had the honour to pay you court then." "Forgive me, but that is impossible," the perplexed Countess said. "The Count of Saint-Germain I knew in those days was at least 45 years old, and you at the outside are that age at present." "Madame, I am very old," he apparently said with a knowing smile. "But then you must be nearly 100 years old," said the astonished Countess. "That is not impossible," the Count told her matter-of-factly. Then he continued to convince the Countess he was indeed the same man she knew with the details of their previous meetings and life in Venice 50 years prior. From here the legend of Saint-Germain sort of grows and expands. People who are particularly in love with the Count's legend say that in 325 CE, at the First Council of Nicaea, the Count of Saint-Germain was in attendance. On the opposite end of the timeline, he's reportedly seen goading people into signing the Declaration of Independence in 1776 CE, or even attending the Great Masonic Lodge Convention of 1932 CE. In short, he's the ultimate legend of the immortal alchemist, a timeless aristocratic scholar attending important events throughout the centuries. In modern times, cults like Theosophy, founded by figures such as Annie Besant and Madame Helena Blavatsky, revere the Count of Saint-Germain as one of the Ascended Masters. a supposed order of immortal alchemists who have undergone enough spiritual transformation to transcend our understanding. The Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn was founded in 1887 by an English Freemason/Rosicrucian named William Wynne Westcott, in attendance with a German Rosicrucian named Anna Sprengel, and two other English Freemasons/Rosicrucians named William Robert Woodman and Samuel Liddell Mathers. In 1888, the Isis Urania Temple is founded in London as the first temple of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. In time, its members comprise some of the most influential cultural figures of the time, such as Bram Stoker, W.B. Yeats, and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. I'd hope you recognize at least some of those names because their writings are still massively famous to this day. Its membership also included some of the most renowned and infamous occultists of the 20th century, such as Julius Evola and Aleister Crowley. Modern-day occult traditions like Wicca and Thelema are influenced by the Golden Dawn to various extents. Similar to Masonic lodges, it had a hierarchical structure, but women were admitted on equal basis with men. There were three orders which tended to be collectively known simply as the Golden Dawn. The first order, aka Outer Order, taught esoteric philosophy based on the Hermetic Kabbalah, as well as astrology, tarot divination, and geomancy. The second, or Inner Order, taught scrying, astral projection, and alchemy. The third order consisted of the secret chiefs, who directed the activities of the lower two orders via spirit communication. Soon after the establishment of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn in 1897, another occult group was founded called the Ordo Aurum Solis, or Gold of the Sun, who acted like a counterpart or alternative to the Golden Dawn. The difference between these two organizations is that while the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn was largely founded on Western traditions, like Rosicrucianism, the Ordo Aurum Solis was based on the Ogdoatic traditions rooted in the teachings of Byzantium and the Middle East. One distinction between them, for example, is that the Golden Dawn used the Hermetic Kabbalah while the Aurum Solis used the Jewish Kabbalah. We won't really be talking much about the Aurum Solis, but I figured they deserved a mention. You know, at this point, those of you who have paid any attention to this giant, sprawling rant of a video will notice a kind of philosophical through line that culminates here. We've got Freemasons, Hermetics, and Rosicrucians all under one roof, partially using John Dee's style of pseudo-scientific methodology, plus the Kabbalah, sacred geometry, alchemy, and so on. It is from this broiling soup that the final boss of occultism emerges. Aleister Crowley. In 1875, Edward Alexander Crowley was born in Warwickshire, England, into a wealthy and extremely devout Christian family who considered indulgences and temptations to be sinful. A classic no fun allowed kind of household. With no alcohol or needless eating, Edward was a good boy who obeyed his parents in all things, and studied the Bible until his father died of tongue cancer when Edward was only 11. Some people say his respect for his father meant that his father's death deprived Edward of any discipline, leading to his slow transformation into Aleister. Others say his overzealous mother made his life so stressful that he fell ill until his cool uncle stepped in to give him a relaxing countryside holiday, full of booze and whores at the age of only 15. Regardless, his mother was horrified at Edward's transformation and labelled him the Beast, or Antichrist, from the Book of Revelation, a title that Edward, or rather Aleister, would wear proudly for the rest of his life. And in some stories, to mark the occasion, Crowley shagged a maid on his mother's bed. Edward had broke bad, and adopted the name Aleister Crowley. He then became a student of Cambridge and began to enjoy his bisexuality to its fullest. For a while after, Crowley pursued normal activities like mountain climbing, poetry, and learning languages. But in 1897, while trying to learn some Russian in St. Petersburg, Crowley fell ill. It is believed this illness came with fever dreams, which Crowley interpreted as mystic revelation that all mortal human endeavours are futile. From this moment onward, Crowley was fully dedicated to the occult. which led to him finding a chemist, or rather alchemist, named Julian Baker, who by proxy introduced Crowley to the previously mentioned Samuel Liddell Mathers, of the also previously mentioned Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. Mathers took a liking to Crowley, and initiated him in the Isis Urania temple into the outer circle of the Golden Dawn. Most members quickly began to distrust Crowley. After all, the members of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn were mostly pious aristocrats, whereas Crowley was a rebellious young man who hated Christianity, saw himself as literally the Antichrist, and outright stated a desire to summon demons and old gods. On top of this, Crowley's methods of ritual involved masturbation, drugs, and sex. His rock and roll, hardcore, degenerate Satanist style hammered home for all the other members how important it would be to stop Crowley from rising in the ranks of the order, because they were certain he would use magic for evil. Crowley even developed a feud with W.B. Yeats, who called Crowley indescribably mad. Crowley and Yeats engaged in a legendary magic battle, kind of like the duels you see in Harry Potter, except replace 100% of the events you're imagining, with Crowley getting kicked down a flight of stairs. Crowley did, however, find a Golden Dawn member who, in exchange for free rent, would teach Crowley higher magic. Crowley was taught a high magic ritual, which he performed every single day with little result, until he got bored and just sort of wandered off. Crowley managed to convince a woman named Rose Edith Kelly to run away with him to escape a loveless arranged marriage to instead marry Crowley. During their sudden and unplanned honeymoon to Egypt, Crowley performed a ritual from a summoning book named Goetica, the Lesser Key of Solomon, in order to summon the Egyptian god Horus. During this, Rose's head fell backwards as she experienced a divine communion with Horus, who gave her instructions on how to communicate with spirits. When Crowley performed a ritual according to these specifications, he heard the voice of his guardian angel Iamblichus, who dictated a large amount of information to him, which Crowley compiled into a book called The Book of the Law, from which comes the famous phrase, "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law," which basically means do whatever works for you when it comes to magic. Magic being spelled with a K at the end to differentiate it from the common trickery of a stage magician. The religion based around this revelation would be called Thelema. It still exists to this day, by the way. In some accounts, he's very happy with this revelatory experience, but when he gushed about it to his colleagues at the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, they were rather skeptical. Some even suspected the spirit he communicated with to be a demon. In other accounts, he initially dislikes everything written in the Book of the Law, and hides it away until much later. From this point forward, imagine that in between every single date and event I list is sandwiched a ton of me saying, and then Crowley wrote a renowned book on mysticism, climbed a mountain, and performed sex and drug-based rituals. Because that's easier than me repeating myself over and over again. In 1907, Crowley starts tutoring paying customers in the occult. And in November of that year, he expands this operation into what he hoped would be a mystic order similar in scope to the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. He titled this mystic order AA, or Argentium Astrum, based in Victoria Street of central London. In 1912, he writes a book called The Book of Lies, but yet another occult order, known as the Ordo Templi Orientis, accused Crowley of publishing their secrets within the book. Crowley tried to convince them that the similarities were totally coincidental, and he succeeded at this speech check so hard that not only did they believe him, but they also made him the head of the Templi Orientis' British branch. In 1914, Crowley's massive inheritance had long since ran dry, and the income from paying students wasn't enough to sustain him. So Crowley sold some of his property. He then climbed mountains and took more drugs because responsibility is a magic word Crowley never actually learned. In 1915, Crowley meets with the North American head of the Ordo Templi Orientis to discuss how best to spread Thelema across the continent. From there he went on a long road trip across America full of sex, drugs, and magic. Imagine Fear and Loathing, but in the early 1900s and full of wizards. In 1920, Crowley, by this point thoroughly addicted to heroin and cocaine, started a commune cult in Sicily called the Abbey of Thelema. preaching the book of the law along with classic Crowley stuff like drugs and orgies, even allegedly dipping into bestiality and animal sacrifice. Also involved was adoration of the sun, study of Crowley's writings, poetry and art, yoga, and on rare occasions they would even do some actual work to maintain their property. Though this work would almost never involve actual cleaning, so the place became rancid and infested with various animals. Heterosexual men tended to bounce off this place because gay sex was mandatory. A woman named Betty had a nervous breakdown and informed the British press about the insane stuff going on at Crowley's Sicily commune, including the death of her husband, who died either from ritualistically drinking a cat's blood, or more likely drinking from a polluted spring which Crowley apparently warned them not to drink from. The British press understandably loved writing articles demonizing Crowley, so they wrote an article labeling Crowley as the wickedest man in the world, even going so far as to suggest he should be hung. Eventually, the Italian authorities under Mussolini forcibly disbanded the commune in 1923. In 1928, Crowley wrote his now most famous work, Magic in Theory and Practice, which he published in 1929 to almost no initial interest at all, certainly a sleeper hit. In 1935, Crowley was declared bankrupt, which he achieved by spending at least 3 times more than his income for a sustained period of his entire life. Aleister Crowley was at that point a gaunt, broke heroin addict, considered loathsome by most people. In an attempt to get some money, Crowley tried to sue somebody for writing a book that labeled him as a black magician. But the case went against Crowley because being a black magician was Crowley's whole brand. As he left the courthouse, a young woman named Deirdre McClellan approached him and, like a scary stalker would do, claimed she had read all of his books, was a huge fan, and that she wanted to have his babies. He accepted this charming and not at all terrifying offer. In 1936, Crowley writes a book called The Equinox of the Gods, and in 1937 his first child with Deirdre was born, and he had eventually settled down in Cornwall, England, where Aleister Crowley lived happily ever after. Or rather until 1947 at 72 years old, where he died of chronic bronchitis. Honestly though, with everything he was doing, it's very impressive he reached 72 years old. After hearing that fairly insane story, you might be somewhat confused as to why he's considered so important and influential. The answer is that he wrote a ton of very important occult books. In particular, his 4th book, Liber Abba. He started a lot of cults, such as Thelema. His Do What Thou Wilt philosophy was one of the founding ideas of the free love movement of the 60s. And last but not least, he directly spoke with and influenced some of the most culturally influential people of the era. For example, in his later years, Crowley began to live off money provided by the California branch of the Ordo Templi Orientis, led by NASA scientist Jack Parsons, who we'll talk about in the next section. In 1945, Crowley was introduced to Gerald Gardner, who would later go on to found the Wicca movement of modern paganism. Jimmy Page, the lead guitarist of Led Zeppelin, purchased Crowley's house on Loch Ness, saying he felt the place was truly haunted. Do What Thou Wilt would be inscribed on the album Led Zeppelin III as a tribute to Crowley, and so on and so forth. You'll note that up until Crowley, most mystics we talked about were also fairly pious and religious, usually respecting or paying tribute to God. Crowley sets the stage for the Satanist punk rock aesthetic we associate with witches and the occult today. Born in Los Angeles, 1914, Jack Parsons grew up in a wealthy but broken home. He spent much of his lonely time reading books on mythology and science fiction. At age 12, young Jack performed poorly at school due to undiagnosed dyslexia. Plus, he was bullied for being effeminate and upper class. A strong lower class boy named Edward Foreman fought off the bullies and befriended Jack due to a shared love of science fiction and rocketry. The two of them began experimenting with amateur rockets, and Parsons began to take an interest in the occult. At the time, of course, the idea that man could ride a rocket to the moon was almost as absurd as magic itself. Both concepts considered by popular culture to be elements of fiction for young boys. While to many an overactive imagination would seem to make one childish and unfit as a scientist, it is actually exactly this quality which makes a scientific breakthrough possible, at least if it's coupled with the necessary education. In 1934, after attending a lecture about a potential high-stratosphere aircraft, Jack Parsons and Edward Foreman met a mathematician and mechanical engineer named Edward Frank Molina. Parsons, Foreman, and Molina grouped up to apply for funding from the California Institute of Technology, or Caltech. Although they didn't get funded, they did end up working in a department called Guggenheim Aeronautical Laboratory, or GALCIT. The trio became a complementary team, with Parsons as the chemist, Foreman as the machinist, and Molina as the technical theoretician. In time, the team would grow to attain the derisive name Suicide Squad, due to their dangerous meddling in explosives, chemicals, and rockets. One example event involved them accidentally enveloping most of the campus in corrosive gas. A popular misconception at the time was that it would be scientifically impossible for a rocket to function in a vacuum. This misunderstanding meant that the Suicide Squad were dismissed outright whenever they mentioned a desire to use their rockets to reach outer space, and so the team mostly had to fund their research off of paychecks from their jobs. During World War II, Caltech was approached by the US military, who found themselves in need of a rocket propellant device to help shorten the distance heavily loaded planes would need to take off in combat zones. Every other aeronautical group said that it was impossible, but the Suicide Squad was happy to tackle the challenge. Since the word rocket was associated with childish science fiction nonsense, the word jet was used instead, leading to the term jet plane rather than rocket plane, even though jets are really just rockets that get their oxygen from their surroundings. This job, and others like it, garnered Parsons and his team, plus the field of rocketry in America, some much-needed respect. As such, Parsons and his band of unlikely misfits began modern rocketry as we know it. In January 1939, Jack Parsons and his wife were invited by a pair of friends to a church of Thelema to witness a ritual called the Gnostic Mass. You remember the Gnostics from way earlier in this video, right? Seems like so long ago now. Eventually they'd start to participate in Ordo Templi Orientis rituals, where they made contact with, you guessed it, Aleister Crowley. By 1941 they joined Crowley's ranks more officially. Parsons initiated an open relationship much to the chagrin of his wife. Oh, but she'd get her revenge soon enough, don't you worry. Parsons and his friends started a corporation named Aerojet to make money off of their inventions. Aerojet remains extremely profitable to this very day, and its components can be found in practically every rocket America has ever sent to space. So while Parsons wouldn't live to see his dream of mankind reaching the moon in a rocket, his contributions to science directly brought his dream into reality post-mortem. In time, however, his cult activities plus communist sympathies and slapdash methodology would degrade government and military confidence in his compatibility with the military-industrial complex. Parsons redirected his passions to immerse himself once again in the world of science fiction, now meeting the prominent science fiction authors of the time, such as a guy you might have heard of called L. Ron Hubbard, who would go on to found the Church of Scientology. As Hubbard lived on Parsons' property called the Parsonage, they would become fast friends until Hubbard took advantage of Parsons' open relationship by having sex with his wife. He'd also later go on to con Parsons out of all of his money. In order to replace his wife, Parsons would try to summon the goddess Babylon to be his new wife, an act so weird even Crowley thought he had gone a bit too far. Soon enough, Parsons would meet a woman named Cameron, who he felt met his expectations, and he decided this must be the Babylonian incarnate. To quote Cameron herself, however, "I didn't know anything about the Ordo Templi Orientis. I didn't know that they had invoked me. I didn't know anything, but the whole house knew it. Everyone was watching to see what was going on." End quote. Anyway, we could go a lot deeper into Parsons, such as his attempt to shatter space and time, his attempt to make a golem, or how he died by blowing himself up with fulminate mercury. But I think you get the gist. At this point you might have noticed a sort of cultural chain of events. Scientology was influenced by Jack Parsons, who was influenced by Aleister Crowley, who was influenced by the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, who were influenced by figures like Sir Isaac Newton and John Dee, who were influenced by Hermeticism and theurgic concepts from Iamblichus, who was of course influenced by Plotinus and the Gnostics, both of whom were influenced by Plato, who was influenced by Pythagoras. You see how everything actually ties together into a vaguely coherent narrative based on the inherent butterfly effect of history, and memetics daisy-chaining back throughout time? You see how a video that at first seemed like an incomprehensible ramble was actually retroactively good the whole time? Feel free to retroactively enjoy the entire video in your brain. Basically, I'm saying we can blame Pythagoras and Plato for Scientology. Gerald Brousseau Gardiner was born into an upper-middle-class family on the 13th of June 1884 in England, less than a decade after Crowley's birth. At a young age, Gerald was badly asthmatic, necessitating he travel to warmer climates to escape the harsh British winters. Rather than stay in one place, he and his nanny Josephine travelled the world together, while Gerald taught himself how to read and write. In 1907, Gerald was initiated into Freemasonry. He then gained employment as a rubber plantation manager. Here he befriended a tribe called the Dayak, who gained a trust for Gerald and taught him their magic traditions. In 1936, Gerald would return to England, where he would also join the Rosicrucian Order Crotona Fellowship. Many of the people he met in Western esoteric societies were enjoyably less rich and snobby than the people he had grown up with, and some of them also claimed to be part of a secretive, unbroken lineage of witches that had existed for centuries called the New Forest Coven. In 1939 he was initiated into the New Forest Coven, who practiced what they called Wicca. As such, Gerald would have it that he didn't invent Wicca, but rather inherited it. The coven taught him all of their methodology and ideas. In 1951, the laws prohibiting witchcraft were repealed, and so Gerald Gardiner saw an opportunity to finally share European witchcraft with the world. The New Forest Coven said they'd rather he didn't spill all of their secrets, but he decided to do it anyway. According to him, he was afraid that if their traditions were not proliferated, they might die out. Other covens across Europe who read his books on the subject apparently contacted Gardiner, expressing their relief that they were not the last of their kind. In time, Gerald created his own coven using basically the same traditions as the New Forest Coven, but supplemented by other methods he had learned from the Rosicrucian Order, native tribespeople, Freemasons, and of course Aleister Crowley. Throughout the late 1950s and early 1960s, his many books and ideas would proliferate across Europe, Australia, and America, where countless variations of what would become known as Gardinerian Wicca were created to such an extent that some variations outright deny influence by Gerald Gardiner at all, even if they're memetically incorrect about that. Basically, if you're like me and half the women you meet profess to be modern witches, then just know that they have Gerald Gardiner to thank for it, even if they either don't know who that is, or otherwise dislike him immensely. The reason why many modern witches dislike Gardiner is due to some controversial statements he made about gender politics, such as the following quote from page 64 from the Gardinerian Book of Shadows. "As a man loveth a woman by mastering her, so the Wicca should love the gods by being mastered by them." End quote. You can imagine how many modern women take issue with the idea that men must master women. Gardiner was also strongly opposed to homosexuality, and stated in Louis Bourne's Dancing with Witches to quote, "Gerald was homophobic. He had a deep hatred and detestation of homosexuality, which he regarded as a disgusting perversion and a flagrant transgression of natural law." Gerald almost shouted, "There are no homosexual witches, and it is not possible to be a homosexual and a witch." No one argued with him. End quote. As such, Gerald Gardiner and Aleister Crowley share a similar quality of being absolutely pivotal to modern occultism, while simultaneously shunned and swept under the rug by most of the inheritors of their ideas. Naturally, we have skipped over a lot of different esoteric traditions and ideas for the obvious reason of the subject matter being cavernous and sprawling. In this diagram from Liber Null and Psychonaut, an introduction to chaos magic, you can see the vast swaths of philosophy we had to skip to reach this point in the narrative. I urge you to continue researching any of these topics yourself if you are interested. Luckily, chaos magic is actually very, very simple. Rather than adhering to a strict tradition of set rituals, beliefs, and practices, a chaos mage does whatever they feel works for them, ignoring its compatibility with other people's practices or esoterica in general. While many such people work alone in their beliefs, those who are more dedicated to it as a life path are attracted to the Illuminates of Thanateros, or IoT. Formed in 1987, the name Thanateros is a mix of Thanatos, the god of death from Greek mythology, and Eros being the Greek word for erotic or sexual love. As such, the organization is basically called the Illuminates of Death Sex. As you can imagine, this group attracts a lot of punky, anarchic types. The eagle-eyed of you might also have spotted what appears to be a contradiction in the very premise of this group. They're an order opposed to order, a group dedicated to individuality, a hierarchy opposed to hierarchy, and they're also anti-secret despite adopting all the trappings and nomenclature of a secret order. The hierarchy in this anti-hierarchical group is as follows: Neophyte, Initiate, Adept, Magus. To rise in these non-ranks, you must simply demonstrate ability with magic, making the group theoretically meritocratic. If you're asking me how you objectively demonstrate magic, the answer is I have no idea. But then again, I'm not a wizard, so what do I know? In 1982, a member named Frater Stokastikos established a temple in Bristol, known only as the Bristol Chaos Temple, or Cabal Heraclitus. The IoT, as it's known in the modern day, started as part of a public seminar in Baum-Rammersdorf, held by Peter J. Carroll and a German practitioner named Ralph Tegetmeier, who would later form a schism in the group during the events known as the Ice Magic War in the early 1990s. Obviously, the Illuminates of Death Sex having a civil war called the Ice Magic War is deadly serious business. Basically, Tegetmeier met a martial artist named Helmuth Barthel, who apparently could perform unexplainable feats of magic via martial arts. Makes me kind of imagine a bender from Nickelodeon's Avatar: The Last Airbender. For some reason, meeting the martial artist Barthel inspired Tegetmeier to propagate a new philosophy called Ice Magic. German and Swiss members of the IoT began switching from chaos to ice magic, but how dramatic this process was is a subject of much debate. Some say a magic battle between mages ensued in a tavern. Others say this battle was entirely fictional. Some say 80% of the IoT defected, while others say only 30%. While the mainstream Illuminates of Thanateros said Tegetmeier was trying to take over the IoT to establish a right-wing authoritarian dictatorship, Tegetmeier himself insists he had no such plans to break down and dominate the IoT structure. Long story short, chaos.
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 Chaos. Chaos. Chaos.
Not all groups who use the word magic believe in overtly supernatural magic, or rather, not in quite the same way. Over the course of 30 years up until about 2015, artists predominantly based in San Francisco coined the term psychomagic, or psychomagical experience. This movement was an extension of a group called the Cacophony Society, rooted in Discordianism, but their beliefs can be traced back to the Situationists. Don't worry, it's a lot simpler than I'm making it sound. The Situationists were a group of French sociologists who observed how our daily behavior is rooted in a set of rigid, culturally programmed habits. There is a kind of default social situation occurring on the street every day, where we all speak and behave a certain way. This default state is what they called the situation, and they saw disrupting the situation as both a method of subtly disrupting the social power structure and just amusing themselves for the sake of novelty. The Cacophony Society are a more organized version of this principle, who are responsible for events such as Burning Man, Then there's the San Francisco underground art movement, who spent decades engineering what they called psychomagical experiences, by which they meant experiences designed to utterly immerse and transform a person's mind, even if only for a short while. This concept eventually became adopted by big businesses to create events like the Hogwarts experience. The use of the word magic in this context does not necessarily denote supernatural power. Rather, it's the idea that if a person's mind has entered an excited or totally abnormal state, then they may as well be experiencing genuine magic. Think of how you felt at Christmas as a child, or the first time you passionately kissed somebody, or the first time you took psychedelic drugs. There's a reason we call these magical experiences. Related to this is the postmodern idea of a reality tunnel, which represents our subjective interpretation of the world as filtered through our senses. In our tunnel, we see or recognize only a limited version of the world, but we can either willingly or accidentally switch tunnels to experience a different interpretation of reality. For example, if you were a spy organization who wanted to cause the self-destruction of an entire country, you could infiltrate the education system of said country and indoctrinate their youths to despise their own culture. You funneled them into a reality tunnel of your own making, so that when they grow up they go into the workforce as entropic, indoctrinated ideologues, ultimately destroying your enemy without even firing a single shot. Good thing that never happens, and that this was a totally hypothetical example. The Cacophony Society and the San Francisco underground art movement sought only to give people who are usually entrenched in the situation unusual or magical experiences. Eventually, gentrification of San Francisco made it impossible for the famously poor artists to live there, destroying the movement. The Cacophony Society, however, is still at large today, relatively secretive in their exploits. Let's end this on a high note by talking about the devil.
People love the devil.
People love worshipping Beelzebub.
The devil, aka Satan, is a character originally portrayed in the #1 best-selling book, The Bible, in which he acts as the main antagonist. However, for many this horned devil is a real and very dangerous manifestation of evil. Throughout the last 2,000 years there have been several satanic panics, some of which escalated into puritanical purges of witches and heretics. In the modern day, however, there are people who view Satan a bit differently, either as a misunderstood positive force, or as a cool anti-hero role model, like the Joker or Patrick Bateman. Satanism really got going in the 1960s with Anton LaVey, a former carnival worker who held night classes on the occult. He wrote several influential books on Satanism and eventually became known as the Black Pope. He became a prominent figure in San Francisco due to his great showmanship and eccentricity. For example, walking his pet black leopard named Zoltan. In the later development of his philosophies, he tied Satanism to more atheistic beliefs about the amoral pursuit of self-interest. You take a little bit of Nietzsche, a sprinkle of Ayn Rand, a dollop of Ragnar Redbeard, and you have yourself a philosophy about pursuing your own sense of justice, while avoiding the herd philosophies of morality and collective will. Many modern Levanists don't believe in the devil as a literal supernatural being, but rather as a positive archetype of individuality and rebellion. From here, various schisms and alternatives formed, sometimes focusing on the supernatural or occult aspects, or sometimes focusing on Satan as an allegorical figure. Generally agreed upon in these groups is the idea that Satan did a good thing by tricking Adam and Eve into eating the forbidden fruit, because it meant humanity gained individuality. Therefore, Satan is a good guy. Much like the Illuminates of Thanateros, they're individualists who decided to form a group, for some reason. Also, woe betide those who mistake the Satanic Temple with the Church of Satan. Obviously, only a fool would confuse those two names. To quote from the Satanic Temple's website, quote, "With unfortunate regularity and much to our chagrin, the Satanic Temple is confused with an earlier organization, the Church of Satan, founded by Anton Sandor LaVey in the 1960s. The Church of Satan expresses vehement opposition to the campaigns and activities of the Satanic Church, asserting themselves as the only true arbiters of Satanism, while the Satanic Temple dismisses the Church of Satan as irrelevant and inactive." End quote. To alleviate our confusion about all this, let's read some more of their website. Quote, The mission of the Satanic Temple is to encourage benevolence and empathy, reject tyrannical authority, advocate practical common sense, oppose injustice, and undertake noble pursuits. End quote. I don't really feel this explains why Satan has to be involved in any way, so let's keep digging. Quote, "We have publicly confronted hate groups, fought for the abolition of corporal punishment in public schools, applied for equal representation when religious installations are placed on public property, provided religious exemption and legal protection against laws that unscientifically restrict people's reproductive autonomy, exposed harmful pseudo-scientific practitioners in mental health care, organized clubs alongside other religious after-school clubs, in schools besieged by proselytizing organizations, and engaged in other advocacy in accordance with our tenets." End quote. Okay, again, that's cool, but why Satan though? You know, like, why do you need Satan to do those things? I'm only getting more confused as I read this. Okay, let's look at the core tenets that these individualists must all abide by collectively. Oh hey, look at number 4. Quote, "The freedoms of others should be respected, including the freedom to offend. To willfully and unjustly encroach upon the freedoms of another is to forego one's own." End quote. Hey, didn't you just say that you confront hate groups, though? Where's the cutoff point for freedom to offend? Is dropping the N-bomb a bit too far, even for Satan, maybe? I don't know, maybe I'm just getting old, you know? I can't understand what you kids are doing with your satanic rituals and contradictory moral stances. I guess I'll just end the video here before I get even more confused. Freemasonry and Rosicrucianism are still abound, but not to a consistent extent in every town or city. For example, in my hometown, nobody knows what a Rosicrucian is. The Theosophists still revere the Count of St. Germain. The Thelemists still revere Aleister Crowley. Some Wiccans still revere Gerald Gardiner. There are even people who perform Enochian rituals using the methods developed by John Dee. There's a million little cults that sometimes gain enough momentum to snag a few celebrities and make national or international news. The vast majority of cultists you'll meet in day-to-day life are either Satanists or more commonly Wiccans. Overall, while from a surface level it appears that in the Western world the occult has been thoroughly defeated by the age of scientific reason, it's more been pushed to the margins by popular culture. However, things on the outside tend to find their way to the center soon enough. And that's the end of the video. Thank you for watching.